Well, that was one of the great things I'll say about Wright, and that is that he remembered that I lived in New Canaan, and there were 50 years separating us in age. But he remembered that I lived here, and he called me. I was mowing the grass, and Mr. Wright said, why don't you come over and have lunch at Rayward's? Because the Rayward House, which became the Shepherd House, which is somebody else's now, they had just finished, and he came over to see it for the first time. So he asked me to come and have lunch. I'd already had lunch, so I just came anyway when I was ready. When we were walking around the grounds, Mr. Wright said, let's go see Philip. Let's call him up and see if we can get there. Or he let us in. So Mr. Wright called, and Philip said he was delighted to have us. So we came on a spring day in 1958. It was about a year before Mr. Wright died. And we came up a walk to the house that was really white pebbles at the time. And it was very brilliant. And as I described the house, it's not only a window, but a mirror as well, because you could see, and it was spring, and the leaves had not really come onto on the trees. Philip came to the door and said, Mr. Wright, welcome to the monkey's house. And Mr. Wright said, why do you call it that? And Philip said, it's because you said that I had designed a monkey's house. And Mr. Wright said, no, Philip, I said that you were capable of doing it, but not that you had. So anyway, he wanted to know if he knew all the people that were there, and he did. Philip knew the Raywards, and Philip and I had met 20 years before. I don't think he remembered me, and I don't blame him for that, but I do remember him. Philip was at Taliesin in Wisconsin, getting ready to put on a show at the Museum of Modern Art of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And I was doing all the photographs of that. But anyway, that's digressing. He let us in, and it turned out to be sort of a cocktail party. There was a table here that had scotch and ice and glasses. And over there where that sink is now, there was a drawing board that Philip had. And there was a big pad and a crayon on it. And Mr. Wright and Alfred Barr and Philip exchanged a lot of barbs. I mean, there was a love-hate relationship between Philip and Mr. Wright. But it was mostly a love relationship, because I remember Philip saying, Frank Lloyd Wright is a genius and I hate him for it. But he did, they were very good friends, and they saw each other quite often. Anyway, the afternoon turned into a lecture on the part of Mr. Wright with jibes from Alfred Barr and from Philip. Mr. Wright was giving a history of architecture, starting with the cave people. And he kept moving forward with the different techniques from bamboo that had been gathered together, and they had vine leaves on the bottom, which eventually became the stylized pillars of Grecian and Roman architecture. He went on like that for some time. He ran out of scotch and came over here and got some new scotch, and he noticed that Ely Nadelman's statue was right in the center where that camera is now. And Mr. Wright moved it over where it is at this point. And he went back to drawing, and they talked, and Mr. Wright kept on sketching, and then he came over and got some more scotch. In the meantime, Philip had moved the statue back to center. And Mr. Wright didn't notice that until he got up the third time to get some more scotch. So it was really getting to be a wonderful afternoon. But when Mr. Wright had finished drawing and talking about how little modern architecture had advanced, because instead of using old techniques and not using enough steel and enough concrete, so far he didn't think it had advanced very much. Now, Philip had just finished the Seagraves building. He and Miss Vanderohe had collaborated for this. And Mr. Wright was busy building his circular Guggenheim Museum. So they were both competing for attention in New York City. But Philip was through with the Seagraves building first. But Mr. Wright saw that Philip had put the statue back on as he was going over with his last scotch. And Mr. Wright just blew up. He said, "Philip, leave perfect symmetry to God." And he put the where it is now, really, is where Mr. Wright wanted it. But he showed what he had done, and it was a complete replica or a rendition or a drawing of the Seagraves building, which was his way of getting even with Philip for what he was doing. He had time. He must have had time because he was living at the Plaza Hotel at the time until the Guggenheim Museum was finished. But Mr. Wright died before they dedicated the Guggenheim. So I don't imagine that he came over often, maybe once after that. But it would have been very difficult for Mr. Wright to have made that trip at age 91 and a half, whenever he was, whenever that time was. So I would say that might have been the only time, but it's not the only time. He and Philip had a very good relationship, even though it was a joking, hateful one. I know that when he came to Taliesin in Wisconsin, he came getting ready for the show at the Museum of Modern Art, and Mr. Wright allowed the fellowship to absolutely trash Philip. And Mr. Wright just gleamed at what the students were saying, and it was I thought it was very rude, but Philip didn't seem to mind. Philip really loved Mr. Wright's architecture to such an extent that he was almost lyrical in describing Taliesin West and Taliesin in Wisconsin. I'm not so sure that this house, in spite of the fact that it's all glass, wasn't influenced by him. I mean, the glass going all the way down to the floor and going up to the ceiling. I think that was early Wright also. And, but I think, Philip was such an honest man that I think that if he thought that Mr. Wright had influenced him, he would have said so at the time. And I think he would have delighted, not hesitated at all to say, see how I copied you. So. Well, at the very beginning of my career, the first job I ever applied for as a photographer was with Frank Lloyd Wright, and I introduced myself for the first time because he wanted to know, who are you? And I said, my name is Pedro Guerrero and I'm a photographer. I had never introduced myself as a photographer before, so he said, come on in and let's see what you can do. And I didn't know very much about Frank Lloyd Wright. I had seen two photographs that had inspired me as a photographer. One of them was Falling Water that Mr. Wright had just finished. And another one was a portrait of him that had been also part of this architectural show. He opened...
Did you have any instructions about...
No, he opened the door and said to me, everything here is important. Photograph whatever your heart desires, yeah. But I went outside and I saw this architecture that I had never seen before. And I didn't know how to approach it. I suppose I could do a bungalow easily enough because that's obvious, but this was a running structure of concrete and stone in different configurations. And the only thing I could do is decide that I had to approach it as sculpture. And since I just left art school, I knew a little bit about sculpture. So I approached it as that. And Mr. Wright let me hang around for a week or so before he said, I'd like to see what you've been doing. So by that time, I had a portfolio of the stuff that I had done, and I told him that the only thing I could do is approach it as a sculpture, which he approved of. Well, he told me that the what I had composed for myself wouldn't do because that isn't what he wanted. And he didn't want to see it again. But I figured he was so old, he was 72 at the time. I liked it. And I thought maybe if he saw it the second time, he might find it, that he'd grown to like it. But when I showed it to him, he looked up and he said, I thought I told you to get rid of this thing, so now I'm going to keep it here, and I want you to come back, and I want you to bring a pair of scissors, and we'll cut it up, but bring the negative with it. So that was my first lesson, and that was, you're not to do that again.